Hey there. It's been a while since I've done a character analysis, but before we jump in, I think a little context is important. I can't overstate how big a deal Assassin's Creed protagonist Ezio Auditore da Firenze was in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Beloved for having a rich, charismatic character arc spanning most of his life across 3 games, Ezio's legacy among video game enthusiasts is unquestionable. Heck, Wikipedia says he's often named among the greatest video game characters of all time. And he was named Best Dressed Assassin at the 2010 Spike Video Game Awards, which, as you know, is an incredibly contentious category. But wait, fans of Assassin's Creed are saying. The guy you're talking about is the star of Assassin's Creed 2. This video says it's about Assassin's Creed 3, so what gives? Assassin's Creed 3 was the 5th game in the series, very helpfully. The 3 games before it all starred Ezio. While the original Assassin's Creed was a big deal on release in 2007, it was the Ezio-based Assassin's Creed games that made the franchise a powerhouse in the industry. Ezio had the toys, Ezio got the video game crossovers, Ezio. It was a risk to take the game in a new direction when they did. And while Assassin's Creed 3 sold really well on launch, the vocal parts of the community were loud and clear. Ezio was better. I recall the new lead being criticized as boring and disappointing, and people would usually point to Ezio as an example of what was missing. But this is a mistake, because Assassin's Creed 3's problem isn't its protagonist. Assassin's Creed 3 is bogged down by problems that make it easy to think there's something wrong with the change of protagonist. Even Ubisoft took the wrong lessons from the way 3 was received, and the franchise has been chasing Ezio's ghost ever since. What follows is my perspective on Assassin's Creed 3's main character, and why I think audiences bouncing off him was a result of poor decisions in story structure. And if we're being real, probably development crunch. Alright, let's get to it. Most Assassin's Creed games share a framing device. People are reliving the past through genetic memories inherited from their ancestors. Basic stuff. Because Assassin's Creed 3 was tasked with wrapping up the future plotline that had been running through all 4 previous games at that point, it had a pretty big burden to bear. And right at the beginning, Assassin's Creed 3 chooses to open on a monologue in this sci-fi present, delivered by the father of the main future guy you've been playing as sometimes, but technically all the times, but kinda almost none of the times. It's a lot. Future Dad recites a summary about the story of the previous 4 games for over 3 minutes. Which might be the worst way to start a sequel to anything. Then you follow up this cutscene with a walking section and then a tutorial before the player is finally introduced to the new protagonist.
Evening, Haytham.
Haytham's backstory is shrouded in enigma, but we experience Haytham as a typically charming, cultured man who's already a powerful leader. This combination of charm, guile, and leadership would feel familiar to series veterans. And you spend a lot of gameplay time following Haytham's story. It's basically a whole story arc. But there's a problem most people are going to have during these sequences. Even if you missed the pre-release marketing, the online discussions, and everything else, all you had to do was look at the box on the way home from the store to see what was really missing. This guy you're playing as, Haytham, he doesn't have a tomahawk shaped like an assassin logo. Haytham's outfit doesn't look anything like this one. We're already at the first major example of how this game's story fails its main character, because Haytham's part of the game ends with a twist. He's a Templar! Oh no! Anyway, that's only after this reveal, and after some more hand-wringing in the sci-fi future, that you finally meet your real main character, Ratonhnhaké. But this bait-and-switch twist means most players are going to spend somewhere north of 5 hours playing the game before they're even introduced to Ratonhnhaké. And to be clear, this is not a multi-protagonist game. Once you've switched, you're done. You're always going to be Ratonhnhaké. Assassin's Creed 3 pulled a Metal Gear Solid 2, if you know what that means.
We've managed to avoid drowning. Good job.
So all that time invested in Haytham as your protagonist might feel like a rug pull, or even an insult. You might actively begrudge Ratonhnhaké for taking Haytham away. And that's before you realize you have to play through more mechanical tutorials as a literal child. Ratonhnhaké has done nothing in the story yet, and mechanically, we already have several meta reasons to be irritated. Haytham's lengthy prologue along with that twist also diminish Ratonhnhaké's story through their existence. Because we know more about Haytham than Ratonhnhaké, we're distanced from the latter's experience of growing up with a mysterious absentee father. Rather than sharing in the mystery and discovery as Ratonhnhaké learns, we know all the answers already, and when Haytham is reintroduced later, that process of discovery they still make you go through becomes kinda tedious. All that said, if Haytham's prologue led into a fantastic story for Ratonhnhaké, I probably wouldn't even need to talk about it. But unfortunately, the decision to spend so much opening time with Haytham and Future Man Desmond is only the first step in a pattern of story choices which undermine Ratonhnhaké as a character. So let's talk a bit more about that. I'd like to address one thing about Ratonhnhaké that moves beyond the mechanics of the plot, and that's the real-world cultural significance of his identity. Video games do not have a wide variety of indigenous player characters, and Ratonhnhaké's existence means a lot for people who don't get to see themselves reflected back in media very often. I bring this all up to say, I don't think I'm qualified to add much to the conversation of what Ratonhnhaké's identity means for us here in the real world. What I am qualified to talk about is the structure of Assassin's Creed 3's story. And when discussing his identity, I intend to use that storytelling lens first and foremost. I'm sure there are going to be cultural nuances I'll miss anyway, and I apologize if I mess anything up. And with all that said, let's talk a little bit about Ratonhnhaké's name. So far, you'll notice in the script I've strictly been calling him Ratonhnhaké, and if you played the games, that might feel a little weird. That's because the game spends most of its runtime calling him Connor. They do use names effectively a few times. One way we see this is how the game acknowledges that people from a minority culture face more barriers with their names just day to day. Listen to Ratonhnhaké's mother explain her name to Haytham when they first meet.
I'm Godzi Zio.
Oh, pleased to meet you. God's day.
Just call me Zio.
Dio.
Zio.
Dio.
She has the energy of someone who's had this exact same conversation with every Starbucks barista she's ever met. And then they probably still wrote her name wrong on the cup. Ratonhnhaké learns this same lesson about perpetual inconvenience over the course of the game. It starts early when he introduces himself to his eventual mentor, Achilles.
My name is Ratonhnhaké.
Right. Well, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that.
And it must be pretty demoralizing to have someone tell you to your face that they're not going to put any effort into learning your name. It's kind of insulting, right? But they never come back to this in a way I found satisfying. But I don't know, it's weird that Achilles never does actually learn Ratonhnhaké's real name, even though they know each other for years over the course of the story. It gives me the impression this was meant to be a silly joke rather than any sort of character flaw for Achilles to overcome, or even just something that was a little rude before they went on with the rest of their relationship. But I'll circle back to their relationship more a bit later. It wasn't until sequence 8 of 13 in the game that I first noticed Ratonhnhaké introduce himself to someone as Connor, and it was in the context of planning a jailbreak with a white inmate. By this time, Ratonhnhaké has learned when to use his alias to avoid derailing a conversation before it's even started, because to use his real name here would cause its own distraction for anyone who isn't from his culture, and he absolutely needs this conversation to go as smoothly as possible.
What's your name?
Connor. Pleased to meet you, Connor.
I like this as a subtle character moment. It's foreshadowing of what's to come, and it's sad that it's necessary for him. But the game doesn't draw a big arrow pointing this out like a YouTube thumbnail either. I missed this my first couple times seeing it, because it didn't even occur to me that something happened here. There's another good example in a side quest when he meets someone who realizes that Connor isn't his real name.
My name is Connor.
That's a lovely name for a man from Wales. What's your real name?
Ratonhnhaké.
A strong name. You should use it.
But the lesson isn't really as subtle here, and I'm not sure it's as effective because it doesn't actually change anything in the narrative going forward because it's a side quest. The problem I have is that his name isn't really utilized this way within the narrative very much. Often the game itself calls him Connor.
Connor?
The subtitles and the menus frequently call him Connor. Why would these places choose to identify him by his alias before his real name? The truth is, I can only imagine they knew it would be easier for audiences. This is also why the game doesn't have Achilles ever learn how to say Ratonhnhaké, because the game isn't interested in examining how Ratonhnhaké uses names in different social contexts.
The boy's name is Connor.
I'm not even sure if the thing in the prison is intentional or not. It might be, but there's a lot of text in the game that doesn't really back that up. And crucially, this choice to use the convenient nickname ends up undermining our protagonist, because it's driving a wedge between the player and Ratonhnhaké. I want to wager a guess that most of the people watching this video don't know how to pronounce Ratonhnhaké's name. I didn't before deciding to make this video, and I already considered myself a fan of Assassin's Creed 3. If you do know how to pronounce it, if you learned it, how? Where? I'm gonna guess if you knew how to pronounce it, you didn't learn it from Assassin's Creed 3. But the game already knows most of its audience is not going to come in knowing how to read this. And instead of putting in the effort to help us learn, it just shrugs and goes, Connor. Say I haven't convinced you yet. Say that the codex and the subtitles and the marketing aren't enough evidence. Well, I saved the best evidence for last. Ratonhnhaké doesn't even pronounce his own name the same way his mother does.
Ratonhnhaké. Ratonhnhaké. Ratonhnhaké.
Ratonhnhaké.
Ratonhnhaké.
The other members of his tribe in the game also use the pronunciation his mother does, which is why Ratonhnhaké is how I chose to say it for this video. But I can't say I'm 100% right, because I don't know. I'm not from that culture, and the game didn't try to teach me. But the fact that the character's real name even had the chance to fall through the cracks means it wasn't given enough of a priority. Imagine playing The Last of Us, but Joel is introducing himself to people as Joel. If everything else is the same, but he's like, I'm Joel. And then Ellie's like, Joel, come on! It would feel amateurish. I don't believe there's any more decisive way to tell your audience your character's real name doesn't matter. Ratonhnhaké is defined by his bravery and earnestness, as well as his stubbornness and his conviction. He is loyal to his family and his tribe, and he grows to care deeply for both his father by blood, Hatham, and his father figure, Achilles. His skills and allegiances are tested as he battles for his home, becomes an assassin fighting against the Templars, and simultaneously takes up arms in the American Revolution to help secure American independence from the British. This is how Assassin's Creed 3 wants you to see Ratonhnhaké. When the game is at its best, he is and does all these things. His virtue drives him to try and help others and to rail against injustice, and these things make him easy to root for. Ratonhnhaké starts his journey as an actual child, so they give you probably the longest picture of his life of any Assassin's Creed protagonist. Despite the odds, I do think this opening is pretty good from a narrative perspective. When I first played it in 2012, the opening seemed a little narratively simplistic to me. Ratonhnhaké gets a Final Fantasy-ized backstory where the villains burn down his home and kill his mom. He confronts one of the game's main antagonists, and he swears revenge. It's very utilitarian, but this is somewhere I think the historical framing of Assassin's Creed really adds a lot to the story, because horrifying real genocides like this happened to real people, just like Radun Hagedun and his tribe. Considering it this way can evoke all sorts of complex feelings about America's history, and America's part in some pretty heinous shit. So after this happens, the game skips a bunch of time, and it disappointed me that Radun Hagedun's village stays basically the same after that time skip. It was probably to save on art assets or something, but combined with there being no clear victims other than Radun Hagedun's mother, it almost feels like the attack never even happened. This really cuts the edge of that opening. And post-time skip, I think they really needed to spend more time examining the consequences of this brutality. It's not long after Radun Hagedun becomes a young adult that he learns about the assassins and decides to go be one. There's some great character building here, where Radun Hagedun pesters Achilles by camping outside his house until Achilles agrees to teach him, basically annoying his way into this grumpy old man's life. But I feel like this excellent setup is never adequately paid off. Past this point, the narrative starts to kind of fall apart, too, which is sad, because I really do like Radun Hagedun as a character, and I think the core there is great. But he's in a story that just doesn't build him up. Even in the beats where Radun Hagedun is doing his own thing, the game frequently has moments that make him look foolish for no reason. There's an early one where Radun Hagedun, who has already been killing a bunch of people, decides he doesn't need to kill William Johnson to further his own goals. Achilles then tells him,
You should have killed him.
and it cuts to 6 months later to prove Radun Hagedun was wrong immediately after this happens.
Radun Hagedun! Radun Hagedun! Ganandokon, why are you here? Has something happened?
William Johnson has returned with all the money required to buy our land. He meets with the elders as we speak. I have begged him to resist, but I fear he shall have his way unless you intervene.
How is this possible? We destroyed the tea.
The Templars are nothing if not resourceful. You should have heeded my warning.
Once Radun Hagedun joins the Assassins, these moments of actual realized character become rarer and rarer because the narrative shifts to put him in frequent contact with historical revolutionary figures. Most of the events in the story stop being about Radun Hagedun and start to become about the American Revolution. You'll occasionally see people talk about how they enjoy Assassin's Creed for the setting. The ability to spend time in these historical places is incredibly novel, and a lot of them spice it up even further by putting you in direct contact with historical events and historical people. Assassin's Creed 3 takes place during the American Revolution, and Radun Hagedun should have a pretty interesting perspective on that, given who he is and where he's from, right? Two different groups of colonizers are warring to control the territory that actually belongs to his people. Except Radun Hagedun gets in real early with Sam Adams, and Sam proceeds to treat Radun Hagedun like a tool of the American Revolution, sending him on errand after errand.
Here we are. Speak with the harbor master and he'll see you home.
Thank you for everything, Sam. I promise one day to repay the favor.
Oh, I'm counting on it.
And in every one of these conversations with Sam Adams, Radun Hagedun just sort of goes along with whatever Adams is planning, despite disagreeing with a lot of what he says. I want to include a longer excerpt here from the game for a couple reasons. This exchange really sits with me. It sat with me for years after playing last time, and it sits with me again now. It's a perfect encapsulation of the problems littered throughout the narrative.
Well, it's good to see the people finally taking a stand against injustice.
Says the man who owns a slave.
Ooh, sorry? I practice what I preach, my friend. She's not a slave, but a freed woman, at least on paper. Men's minds are not so easily turned. It's a tragedy that for all our progress, still we cling to such barbarism.
Then speak out against it.
We must focus first on defending our rights. When this is done, we'll have the luxury of addressing these other matters.
You speak as though your condition is equal to that of the slaves. It is not.
Tell that to my neighbor who was compelled to quarter British troops, or to my friend whose store was closed because he displeased the crown. The people here are no freer than Surrey.
You offer excuses instead of solutions. All people should be equal, and not in turns.
It's in turns, or not at all. We must compromise, Connor.
Ratonhnhaké is extremely correct here, right? Ratonhnhaké is advocating for the rights of everyone now because people are actively suffering. Adams, meanwhile, offers waffling excuses to justify the status quo. He puts himself and his own needs first, and when Ratonhnhaké accurately calls this out as bullshit, Adams has the nerve to say that a guy having his shop closed is somehow comparable to being literally enslaved. But the game knows this is bullshit, so what's the problem? The problem is that the game doesn't do anything with that. After this conversation, they just move on like it was a friendly debate, rather than something that's deathly serious. So this whole thing is the problem trying to analyze Ratonhnhaké and his character arc. He has one, things change, those things are part of the game, but his arc is frequently pushed in the back seat so players can tour through a virtual theme park instead. They crammed Ratonhnhaké into a frankly absurd amount of historical events. Seriously, Ratonhnhaké is present for the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Ride, the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord, Washington's appointment to Commander-in-Chief, the Battle of Bunker Hill, foiling Thomas Hickey's plot to kill Washington, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, meeting Washington at Valley Forge, the Great Fire of New York, 1776, not to be confused with the Great Fire of New York, 1835, Washington's crossing of the Delaware River, the Battle of Monmouth, the Battle of Chesapeake Bay with an emerald of grass, the Siege of Yorktown, and Evacuation Day. And that's just the ones I figured out by cross-referencing my playthrough with the Ratonhnhaké page on an Assassin's Creed fandom wiki and looking at Wikipedia. This also doesn't factor in the dozens of interactions he has with historical figures like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Charles Lee, and so many more, like General Lafayette, for example. You guys know who General Lafayette is, right?
You know your own history, yeah? You don't know who he is, do you?
The point is that several of these events, by themselves, were already important enough to be defining events in real people's entire lives. We only know who Paul Revere is because of his ride. The game's narrative contorts itself into pretzels to put Ratonhnhaké at every single one of these events, and he's often pivotally important. Not only does this make the narrative really hard to believe, but it makes the game more about the Eurocentric viewpoint of US history we've already seen in a lot of other places. It's only made worse by the way Ratonhnhaké acts during these events. He is always helping America, and often with little or no personal reason to do it. It's muddled at best. He recognizes the Americans are not looking out for him or his tribe, so his insistence on continuing to help becomes more baffling and irritating as time goes on.
I will find church for you.
Why? What reason have you to help?
Does it matter?
I also want to point out how bizarre this game's use of historical figures ends up being. The game constantly pandered to the US in its marketing, in its setting, in casting the British as the persistent villains. It did this so much it actually upset some folks in Britain at the time. But despite all this, it makes almost every single one of its American Revolutionary heroes look absolutely terrible. It's a bizarre mixture of pro-American patriotism and cynical reevaluation that gives the story the texture of two incompatible flavors mixed together. Like someone stirred relish into a chocolate milkshake. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at good old Washington. I can't recall a less flattering depiction of George Washington in pop culture. Ralph Wiggum's performance has more pizzazz.
Dear madam, would you put a price on the air we breathe or the providence that sustains us? But couldn't we just give in to the British? Never!
Quick aside here, nothing that is a problem with the character's portrayal has to do with the excellent voice actor. We already know what this actor is capable of.
They played us like a damn fiddle!
And the doctor was never heard from again! Anyway, that's how I lost my medical license.
Let's just jump to it then. The big problem. The thing that not only destroys Washington's image in this game, but makes the whole story of the game completely unbelievable. Take a look.
And what's this?
Private
Well, of
correspondence.
course it is. Would you like to know what it says, Connor? It seems your good friend here has just ordered an attack on your village. Although attack might be putting it mildly. Well, tell him, Commander.
We've been receiving reports of Allied natives working with the British. I've asked my men to put a stop to it.
By burning their villages and salting the land, by calling for their extermination, according to this letter. Not the first time, either. Tell them what you did 14 years ago.
That was another time. The 7 Years' War.
And so now you see what happens to this great man when under duress. He makes excuses, displaces blame, does a great many things, in fact, except take responsibility!
Enough!
Ratonhnhaké has just learned the attack at the beginning of the game. You know, the one where his town was burned and his mother murdered. It was actually ordered by George Washington. And in this scene, George Washington has just ordered another attack, and here's where it gets really wild. Look at what Ratonhnhaké does.
A warning to you both. Choose to follow me or oppose me, and I will kill you.
And then he continues to work for Washington. He's a little more surly about it, but he's still doing things for Washington and the Patriots, including killing his childhood best friend who has sided with the British. I don't think any other creative choice could have possibly stripped more agency from Ratonhnhaké as a character. How could he possibly have ever accepted this? After all this stuff, there's an epilogue mission where Ratonhnhaké plays bocce ball with Washington. This is how it ends between them.
False promises from false friends.
I got you figured out. I'm happy with that.
Now look, I understand that for Assassin's Creed 3's narrative to make sense, you can't just kill George Washington. Unless you go completely alt history, which the game toys with in a post-story DLC that I admittedly haven't finished. But that DLC is in an alternate dimension, and even at the start of it, Ratonhnhaké is saying that Washington is a good dude.
He is a man of reason, if nothing else. That was not the man I once called my friend.
The end result of all this is a story that's trying to toe a line where Ratonhnhaké can be both upset with Washington and still admire him as a historical, heroic figure. But it doesn't work. No man who helped kill Ratonhnhaké's family would ever be worth considering a man of reason. So you may be thinking, if Washington and the historical angles are so bad, where are the good bits? If Ratonhnhaké is a good character, what parts of the narrative make that true? Achilles and Hatham, two guides for Ratonhnhaké at opposite ends of several conflicting ideals at once. In fact, I would argue that his relationship with these two characters is the metaphorical core that's running through every part of Assassin's Creed 3. Ratonhnhaké, Hatham, and Achilles are all fictional characters, so the writers get to use them more creatively here. The most obvious is that Hatham is a Templar while Achilles is an assassin, but it goes so much deeper. And I would guess it's intentional that Ratonhnhaké struggles with his relationship with two father figures, in the same narrative that he's helping the Founding Fathers create a new nation. It's never shown to us in the game why Hatham is totally absent from Ratonhnhaké's childhood, But the effect is that he is a privileged, yet deadbeat dad. Achilles, meanwhile, is downtrodden, but takes Ratonhnhaké:dun in anyway to help him grow into a ruthless killing machine. Heartwarming. Haytham metaphorically represents the British, and Achilles metaphorically represents America. In this context, we're seeing the powerful patriarch of British oppression, through Haytham, and the plucky underdog who values freedom and independence in Achilles. Ratonhnhaké:dun argues frequently with Achilles. He pushes against Achilles' advice and frequently plays the role that a rebellious teenager would. But Ratonhnhaké:dun is always welcome home. Meanwhile, with Haytham, he constantly manipulates his son and puts him into needless danger.
If you can't handle a couple of mercenaries, then we've really no business working together.
Unbelievable.
Ratonhnhaké:dun is a tool for Haytham's plans and schemes. But I'm not sure if that was by design, because Ratonhnhaké:dun is clearly meant to be torn between the symbolic offerings of his two father figures.
You've met your father, haven't you?
I do not claim to trust the man or even like him. I would be remiss to ignore this opportunity.
But then, as far as being a dad goes, Haytham sucks, and it's obvious. The game wants us to see Haytham as more sympathetic than he is, I think. But they're coasting on the goodwill earned from our time playing as him and his charismatic voice actor. In fact, Haytham turned out to be a huge fan-favorite character from this era, and he got a big role in Assassin's Creed Rogue, along with his own spin-off novel and comic books or something, I don't know. A lot of this media portrays him as more complicated and sympathetic, but if you're looking at Assassin's Creed 3 as a solo story, Haytham's portrayal is way too damning to see him as anything other than a villain. And that's fine, to be clear. Haytham is a really great villain and an enjoyable character. But don't be lured in by his siren song. He's a real bastard. Near the climax of the story, Ratonhnhaké:dun and Haytham come to blows over their allegiances. When Ratonhnhaké:dun rejects Haytham, he's ultimately rejecting the metaphorical stand-in for Britain's rule, and the power structures threatening a new America. And when Ratonhnhaké:dun kills Haytham, he's clearing the way for America to prosper. But this whole thing is not portrayed heroically, and I like that part about it. Ratonhnhaké:dun feels no joy in Haytham's death, and as we've discussed, America's victory is not Ratonhnhaké:dun's victory. Circling back to Achilles, there are a few problems with him in the narrative too. As the Obi-Wan to Haytham's Darth Vader, Achilles sure does not get much screen time. A lot of the revelations in his arc with Ratonhnhaké:dun are messy or misplaced too. For example, there is a beautiful, somber scene where Achilles dies peacefully at home, and Ratonhnhaké:dun holds a funeral for him, but it's not in the main story. Achilles doesn't actually die during the game at all, unless you finish a tedious series of side missions that are honestly not worth anybody's time. For how beautiful this scene is as a capstone, and for how clearly it articulates the themes of the whole story and their relationship, it really should have been mandatory. Even with all these critiques, the dynamic between these three feels like the best part of the narrative. I really like the thematic elements at play between these three characters. There's a surprising amount of depth, and if the devs had more time to put it together, it could have really won over skeptics. But the execution was marred by an overemphasis on American history lessons, and a general inconsistency about what to do with Ratonhnhaké:dun's character arc. Naysayers about Ratonhnhaké:dun were a lot more common when the game was fresh, but most of the people who disliked the game have already moved on and didn't look back. The most common sentiment I saw while researching was a sort of heartfelt cult following. People still look at these old cutscenes and trailers and pivotal moments, and they talk about how Ratonhnhaké:dun is their favorite assassin. Ratonhnhaké:dun was honest, courageous, and tenacious. He was earnest and heartfelt and cared deeply about tragedies. They wanted him to be a representation, not of an ideal American beginning, but the foundation of what America really was and what could happen from there. A lot of this is stated explicitly in that Achilles' funeral they put in the side content.
A community to serve as an example of what this would-be nation could become.
Assassin's Creed 3 doesn't credit the goodness in America to the founding elite, but to the melting pot of common people who come together and make something better out of imperfect circumstances. The ending of Ratonhnhaké's story is seeing his tribe pushed from their lands, and slavery in the open markets on Evacuation Day. These scenes in tandem are heartbreaking, but they speak to a fundamental truth about America that drives deeper than any jingoistic propaganda ever could. America's founding was flawed, but with conviction, with courage, with will and integrity, an America that exists for the freedom and benefit of everyone is possible. And that's a message a lot of us really need right now. I just wish Assassin's Creed 3 had been a little more consistent about delivering it.